Hello everyone and welcome back to Whiskey Wednesday. Another feature via Cheaper by the Dram this week. We did a Glengarry video on them like more than 2 months ago now. Went down a storm, you guys really seem to like it. I bought a couple of samples from Mark and his company, like some old Macallans and stuff, just to try them. Today we've got something pretty interesting. Some of you may be aware of the brand of White Horse. When this shop first opened nearly 7 years ago now, we used to have it. And I never knew what it was, and it went away quite quickly, and I don't know where it is anymore, if it still exists. I know Diageo own it, but I don't know what they're doing with it. But it's got a pretty interesting history. We'll get to the whiskey in a minute, but I'll try and just reel off these facts for you because it's got quite an interesting past. So in 1881, it was started as a brand. Peter Mackey was the man who started it, and it was all Islay whiskies, and Lagavulin was at the heart of it, and a few other Islay styles too. In the 1920s, Peter unfortunately passed away. And then instead of being called Mackey & Co, it was turned into White Horse, and it's got this nice story on the front of the label about why it's called that. We got some close-ups of that so you guys can see it later on. And then it went through a bit of a sordid past, so Laphroaig essentially didn't want to sell them whiskey anymore to put into a blend. And as a result of that, in 1908, a distillery called Maltmill was formed. And that distillery existed until 1962, so it only functioned for 54 years. In a bit of a cheeky fashion, would have been Peter at the time, he got an exact replica of Laphroaig stills, and he even poached their master distiller to try and make this Laphroaig spirit to keep his blend consistent. But it turned out that even if you have the exact same still type and shape and the guy who used to make it, you're not really going to replicate Laphroaig, and Maltmill became something of its own style. When the distillery shut down in 1962, there's been no recorded elements of the single malt ever being bottled and or sold, except in this. I'm unsure if this is from 1958 or 1959. It says 58 on the bottle, but then it says 1959 in biro on it. But this contains some Maltmill. Having never tried it on its own, I'm unsure as to what it should taste like, but we'll kind of reel through the tasting and see what's typical Lagavulin, what's typical Islay, what's a little bit different. And then White Horse itself, blended whiskies still get a little bit of a bad rap, unfortunately. I always describe like single malt is like listening to a solo instrument, a blend is like listening to a whole orchestra or an entire band. It's got loads of different nuances going on with it, and everything creates this nice crescendo of sound. This is particularly old. This is, as a bottling, is actually older than either one of my parents by 1 or 2 years. So as a blend and as a company, it's got quite a lot of history. I'd love to know what they're up to right now. But one of the more interesting facts about these guys is that it's like the bottle's got a screw cap on it. And when they introduced that in 1926, sales doubled in 6 months because it was just easier to use. It's one of the reasons Japanese companies use screw caps, because it's just more consistent than a cork. It doesn't break as often. But smell-wise, we should be expecting all Islay. So we'll dive in and we'll see what's going on with it. Yep, it's Islay. It's a bit hairy on the nose in terms of ABV. It says 70 proof on the bottle, but 40% on ABV on the little card that comes with it. I'm pretty sure this would have been done in like old fluid ounces, so I'm really not aware of the math. So 70 proof could be 40%, or in modern lingo it could be 35%, but it's a little bit kind of bitey on the nose. But there are certainly elements in there of things like younger Lagavulin. For those of you that tried Lagavulin 8-year-old a couple of years back, it has a little bit of that kind of mezcal, tequila-y thing going on with it. There's a really nice, I get this from most Islay whiskey that's bourbon cask matured. It's like a white chocolate note, like a really creamy, granulated sugar kind of smell. And in general, it smells quite young. I say no age statement on the bottle. There are probably utilising younger whiskies because Islay works best when it's young. If this doesn't contain Laphroaig in it, I get it because there's no kind of over-the-top medicinal style note. Although saying that, when Maltmill would have been invented, Laphroaig wouldn't have been making that modern style they make. That only really came in the 1930s through a guy called John Campbell. So Laphroaig prior to 1930, yeah, again, I wouldn't know what it tastes like. So this is a bit of an adventure within itself. But it smells like Islay, it smells like young Islay. Not too peaty, just a little bit. Slightly salty, but like a white chocolatey thing going on. But we'll taste it, we'll see what's happening. It's very soft. There are all sorts of errors that we can't control that may have happened while this whiskey has just been stored and where it's been for most of its life. It is a very light taste. I think if people were bottling stuff like that now, you'd love it because it smells a little bit smoky and a bit sweet, and it almost disappears on the finish. In a way that isn't annoying like it's short. It's actually quite refreshing and quite light. It's slightly salty. If you took Brook Laddie Classic Laddie and watered it down to below, like, you know, 50%, like 40-ish%, 35% maybe, it's got that element to it. It's almost like someone's peated like a Rosebank or a Daffmill or something. Really, 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 really light. Just like, and the tiniest bit of smoke and the tiniest bit of spice. Probably just because it's been in a bottle for such a long time. It's not as fresh as you would have got it like straight off a bottling line at the time. Really interesting though. I'm not sure what score to give it. Like in terms of an interest in how cool the bottling is and the sample, it's like nearly a 10 in terms of how cool the project is. In terms of flavour, if it existed today, I probably wouldn't buy it because it doesn't tip my boxes at all. It seems brutal, but purely based on if it was a modern product, it'd get like a 6.5, which seems low, but it is really light on the flavour profile. And there are things in here that I don't know what to look out for. So like pre-30s Laphroaig, Maltmill, who knows what that tastes like. I get the Lagavulin, I get that young, lovely Lagavulin-ness, but it doesn't last long enough. It's not around for a long enough time to make it more interesting. That's the whiskey rather than the actual story behind it. So I think I'm going to give it a 6.5. It seems a bit low, but in terms of the ability to buy something like this, that's nearly a 10 in my books. That's pretty cool. I think it was like £10 for a sample of this, rather than a couple of hundred or maybe £1,000 per bottle. So thank you very much for watching. This is a 1958 or 1959 bottling of White Horse that contains some Maltmill whiskey in it. Didn't know what to look for, but it's a pretty unusual style, especially for something that's Islay based. But thank you very much for watching, and we will see you all next week. Cheers.